it's tied to expeditionary war. It's tied to the hyper-capitalism that we were just talking about, this obscene system of profits for few. Adrienne Huck is proof, though she doesn't need me to say so, that the youth, in many cases, has the most skin in this game, in the climate game, in the anti-militarism game, and in the obscene economic inequality that's tied to all of it, because their future is on the line. And the question that's really raised is, will they have grandkids? Is that a possibility? And I think that goes beyond hyperbole. The future is on the line, and we do well to listen to their voices and assessments. And so Adrienne Huck is the co-founder of the New Haven Climate Movement's Youth Action Team. She is a 2020 graduate of New Haven Schools, a volunteer at the New Haven Peace Commission, tying these things together. And in her work regularly, as I was doing my research and getting inspired, which is always a great thing, she's pressuring city and business leaders not to ignore the climate emergency amid the pandemic response. And it's important to note on this climate issue that even the Pentagon, at least until Trump put some pressure to remove the terminology, which the Defense Department being the biggest polluter, right, one of the great polluters on the planet, but even they, for their sins and for their practicality, sometimes had to recognize that climate change is real. And I think that's instructive as we have a nation that largely sleepwalks to catastrophe. And there's no issue, and the sort of activism that Adrienne does that more links the local to the national and the global. So I look forward to your remarks, and thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much for introducing me. I'm very honored to be here today, and I'm going to be sharing my screen. I do have a slideshow to share with you all, so just 1 second there. All right, so first I would like to start with just introducing myself and who I am. So as previously mentioned, I am the co-founder of New Haven Climate Movement's Youth Action Team. I'm also a 2020 graduate from New Haven Public Schools, and right now I'm a freshman at Tufts University, and I'm studying environmental studies, unsurprisingly. And so with the Youth Action Team, I've been with them since 2019, and the New Haven Climate Movement is a grassroots organization of New Haven area residents, and our youth team consists of mainly high school and college-age students, and together we push for strong action on climate change from the New Haven city government, and we mobilize residents and local organizations to learn about and act on the climate emergency. And we fight for government policies that will restore a safe climate and a just future. And also, since this is the Connecticut Peace Conference, I want to bring up that the climate crisis poses unique challenges to New Haven and Connecticut as a whole. Sea level rise and storm surges endanger people and infrastructure in our coastal communities and along Long Island Sound. New Haven is already home to countless climate refugees fleeing from their homes in Puerto Rico after Hurricane Maria. And so we believe that New Haven must take immediate action to address this emergency, and we support prioritizing equity and justice in our solutions. And the reason I got involved in this work was that I am very, very terrified of business as usual, with the amount of consumerism we partake in the first world and the waste we create in the United States. And just for a little bit of background on things that we've been working on, we push for a Connecticut Green New Deal. We're mobilizing state senators to back a Connecticut Green New Deal with a focus on how our shoreline communities are impacted. We have an electric future committee that's working with the New Haven city government to push for electrifying more of our buildings and moving away from fossil fuels. We have a climate education committee that's pushing for climate change and climate justice education in New Haven public schools. And we have a campaign for pushing a climate justice and green jobs fund, and for the city of New Haven to contribute $1.1 million to invest in clean energy jobs creation, energy efficiency outreach programs, and transportation improvement. And one of our main successes has been passing the Climate Emergency Resolution in 2019, which called for zero emissions from the city by 2030, and equitable outcomes for marginalized communities, as well as establishing a city task force to work on the climate crisis. And so we had a really busy summer of outreach and public actions with the fresh energy that this new youth team brought to the movement. And it was unanimously passed by the alders in August 2019. And just as a little bit background on other successes, we've been able to pass the New Haven Climate and Sustainability Framework in 2019. As I mentioned, this climate emergency resolution in 2019. In 2020, we actually got the city to commit $550,000 into capital funding towards climate infrastructure projects, as well as $50,000 in their general 2020 budget towards climate solutions. So that brings us to a total of $600,000. We also have a parallel project called CHEP, short for the Climate Health Education Project, and I've been facilitating their high school internship since 2018, where we recruit students from different New Haven area high schools and work with them to advance climate change education in their schools. And of course, through the years, we've mobilized our community and our youth to act on the climate crisis. And now this brings me to my peace advocacy and how I got involved in this fight. So actually the chair of the New Haven Peace Commission reached out to me last year if the New Haven climate movement would endorse their referendum that they were pushing to be put on the New Haven ballot regarding if Congress should transfer funds from the military budget to cities for human needs, jobs, and an environmentally sustainable economy. And once I saw that, I was definitely on board. I got New Haven Climate Movement to sign on, and since then, I've been involved with the New Haven Peace Commission. And the referendum was very successful. 83% of people that voted on the referendum chose yes. And really, after learning what the federal military budget looks like and how it clearly prioritizes militarism over the quality of life for our residents and, of course, the environment within the US, it really became urgent to me that we must mobilize to change our reality and defund the military. And so I'm pretty new to this peace movement, but I must admit that peace advocacy deserves so much more recognition. I definitely don't hear too much about this movement when I believe it should be important to anyone that sees an issue with killing people and with funding destruction of our world and communities abroad. And the truth is that funding trillions of dollars into the military to wage endless wars and establish dominance has prevented us from investing in true security and services for our people in the US. So now I want to go over some really key points about how the climate crisis is related to militarism. So first, the US Department of Defense is the largest single producer of greenhouse gases in the world. So unsurprisingly, the US militarism degrades the environment and contributes directly to climate change. And according to a recent study from Brown University, the US Department of Defense is the world's largest institutional user of petroleum, and so correspondingly, it is the single largest producer of greenhouse gases in the world. The US military produces about 59 million metric tons of greenhouse gases annually, which is more than entire industrialized countries such as Sweden. Next, control over oil causes wars. So oil is the leading cause of war. An estimated 1/4 to 1/2 of all wars since 1973 have been linked to oil, and the US is not exempt from fighting wars for oil. The vast military infrastructure around the world is also strategically positioned in oil and resource-rich regions and along shipping lines that keep the fossil fuel economy in operation around the globe. And by far, our greatest militarization has been in the Middle East, where more than half of the world's oil reserves are also located. Next, also unsurprisingly, military infrastructure and equipment has a huge carbon footprint. So maintaining an expansive military requires significant investment in carbon-intensive infrastructure and gas-guzzling equipment. And there are 800 US military bases in 90 countries and territories across the globe, and so the associated carbon imprint is tremendous. Next, of course, the act of warfare is carbon intensive. Warfare itself, the United States military has emitted more than 1.2 billion metric tons of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere since the present era of American conflicts beginning in 2001. Next, all of this definitely ruins the health of the environment and the people that are living there. US military operations wreak havoc on the environments where it wages war. Also, most of the bases store large quantities of weapons, explosives, and other hazardous waste. and nearly all of them contain toxic chemicals. In the United States alone, there are tens of thousands of polluted sites linked to military contamination, and that is not even including the toxic legacy that's left behind in sites where there's little accountability or oversight. And an example of that is the burning of military waste in Iraq contributed to a widespread poisoning of the environment, and it's linked to elevated rates of cancer and birth defects, described as the highest rate of genetic damage to any population ever studied. Next, as we know, we have an overinvestment in military, and that means there's an underinvestment in many, many other social issues, and that includes climate action and humanitarian aid. In 2020, military spending accounted for 54% of all federal discretionary funding, which is a total of $756 billion. And by comparison, the budget only included $2.7 billion for energy efficiency and renewable energy, meaning the military budget in 2020 was 272 times larger than for energy efficiency and renewable energy. Also, for every dollar spent on diplomacy and humanitarian aid in 2020, the US spent $16.65 on the military. And so this underfunding of aid and diplomacy has terrible implications for the climate crisis, since it is a global problem, and climate justice depends on international cooperation and helping other countries out. And compared to the $6.4 trillion spent on war in the past 20 years, the cost of shifting the US power grid to 100% renewable energy is estimated to cost just $4.5 trillion. So we could have shifted off our country's fossil fuel reliance with money to spare, but instead we chose violence and destruction. Next, climate change brings along the prospect of even more conflict. So this is somewhat of a feedback loop. Climate chaos in turn leads to massive displacement, militarized borders, and the prospect of further conflict. So to map that out, warfare contributes to climate change, and then the unrest that comes about afterwards can cause even more wars and even more environmental damage. So if we don't transform our society now, we'll face even more injustices and more conflicts in a climate changed future. And lastly, I wanted to tie this into workers' rights. Extractive and militarized industries trap and exploit workers. So I wanted to make this link because the exploitation of workers is directly tied to the exploitation of our environment. And just as with extractive industries such as the fossil fuel industry, militarized industries such as weapons manufacturing create economic dependence, and some communities lack that economic self-determination and unfortunately have their future tied to the well-being of this industry. And the military is the only major federal jobs program in the US, and it has long preyed on low-income people and recruiting people who lack other options or have significant debt and instability. So the climate crisis must also address the absence of jobs that would come about by defunding the military, but luckily, funding a green economy instead of a bloated military budget would be a net job creator. For the same level of spending, clean energy and infrastructure would create 40% more jobs. So next, this brings me to where we go from here. So first, I want to mention that we should reject the notion of greening the military. There was recently a proposal about trying to make the US war machine more fuel efficient, but that misses the point entirely. Aspirations of carbon neutrality could promise fuel efficiency, but it does not make the United States military any less violent or any less oppressive, and we can't go forward with an extractive economy that is harming both people and the ecosystems. So to change the direction of our country, to move the money from military to human needs, repair the climate, and build infrastructure, we should, 1, support a wealth tax. It's estimated that enforcing taxes on the wealthy, corporations, and Wall Street could yield $866 billion annual revenue. And with that money, there are so many possibilities that we could use to uplift our people, including investing in climate solutions. Next, supporting anti-capitalist efforts are important. We need to keep in mind that it's the same capitalism that extracts finite resources, generates pollution, and exploits communities and workers is the same militarized system that profits off of war and violence on Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities. fighting against capitalism is definitely a long and hard fight, but it's important because a change in our system can alleviate a lot of the oppression